Real estate is always a hot topic when it comes to Nicaragua. People coming to Nicaragua often discover that it is a market that is very different than what they are expecting and different than what they are used to, and there is a lot of questions about how things do work, should work, and what's going on that often throw them off guard. There's often a lot of misinformation as well when information is available, which quite often it is not. So we have a playlist on here of a lot of topics about real estate here in Nicaragua. My name is Scott L. Miller, and I'm a full-time immigrant living in Nicaragua. Over the past 10 years, I've been involved in my own real estate here. I am not a real estate professional. I do not work as a broker or as an agent. You can't engage me to buy and sell real estate for you, but I do my best to provide information about the market to all of you. And last week we had a video about the 8 rules that people need to follow when doing real estate in Nicaragua, and today we're following up with 10 important bits of information, 10 points of information that you need to have in order to wisely understand what is going on in Nicaraguan real estate. So we're going to get to those 10 topics about Nicaraguan real estate right after the bump. Let's jump right in. At number 1, the government doesn't know how much a house has been sold for. This is a really important concept. Now, in any market, it is possible for any given transaction to be something that is at least to some degree opaque to a government. But if you're used to North America, for example, the general information about nearly all home transactions and car transactions are well recorded by state or federal governments, and a lot of information about the value of houses as far as what they are actually being traded for on the market is collected. This is very tightly controlled through a lot of mechanisms, and because there's so much information, they're able to detect when information is missing in most cases. If a house was to sell dramatically above or below a believed market value, it would be very easy for the government to detect that and look into the situation. In Nicaragua, there's no such information for a lot of reasons, and a lot of the points we're going to make today will highlight them, but this starting point is super important and gives a basis for so many of the other points, and of course to the set of rules that we gave just recently. Many times transactions happen in cash, sometimes they happen through barter systems, and a very common scenario is that a portion of a transaction happens inside Nicaragua and is visible or semi-visible, and another portion of the transaction, which may be a minority or a majority of the transaction, may happen extranationally, that is outside of Nicaragua, and the Nicaraguan government may have absolutely no insight into that. The degree of privacy in transactions that individuals have in Nicaragua is much more extreme than you are used to in places like the US or Canada, and this can be very confusing because we're used to the government having deep insight into banking transactions and financial transactions and real estate transactions. And in Nicaragua, while they try to have as much visibility as they can, it is still pretty limited. And so if you were to go to the government and get a list of what houses have sold for over time, not only would it not be a very up-to-date list because so many houses just don't sell, which we'll talk about, but it would also be inaccurate. In most cases, the numbers that are on the rolls would be very low compared to what a house actually sold for. And it could be that only a upfront amount of money is recorded and more payments are made over time, or that labor is done for someone, or something has been traded, or it's just a much more dynamic market as far as how those things work. Being a small country, those things are able to work very differently because of the sense of community and how little mobility there is of the people. In the United States, this would be extremely difficult to pull off on any scale, but in Nicaragua, the scale allows for it to be the norm rather than a unique exception. And so really internalizing that no entity, especially the government, actually knows the value of any individual home, and because there's a general lack of knowledge about every home, there's a general lack of information about homes in general. Unlike the United States, where the government, at least at the state level, can accurately predict within a few percentage points the value of any given home with quite some accuracy, in Nicaragua, that simply can't be done. Even the government would be guessing wildly as to what an individual property might sell for. At number 2, there is no MLS or multiple listing service. This would be a system that, if you've never worked with it or seen it directly, this is the information system, the big database or collection of databases that runs behind the scenes and empowers the North American real estate market. This is how your agents in North America are able to give you comparable prices, histories of properties bought and sold, and a listing of everything on the market within a physical area that fits whatever criteria you're looking for. You want a 4-bedroom, 3+ bath with an attached garage on a suburban street, listing at no more than $400,000, but no less than $600,000, or the other way around. No more than 400, no less than 225,000, and you just get a list of all these properties. It's the MLS that allows that to happen in North America because of the reason we just mentioned. The government does not know what is being bought and sold and the information about it. There is nothing like an MLS available on the market. There's no entity to collect that information to be able to put it together. There simply isn't the source of the information. If there was, an entity would arise to do so very easily, but there simply is not. Similarly, in North America, there was Twilio and more recently Zillow, both are pretty old at this point, which operate much as a public MLS, slightly different than the official MLSs, and often more powerful with a lot more technology and open to the public so that non-real estate agents are able to use it. This has completely changed the real estate game in North America. Of course, since that initial source of information does not exist, these entities do not exist either. So there's neither the private MLS nor the public Zillow style MLS here on the market. The way that it works in North America is that the government actually collects all this information. The MLSs use some of their own information and that government information to provide the system, and Zillow likewise pulls all those public records and assembles them into a massive system along with some GPS data and so forth, and so they're able to accumulate a certain amount of information. That source information does not exist in Nicaragua, so the services that would run on top of it also do not exist. This is a shocker for a lot of people. They're so sure that such a system must exist that they make a lot of assumptions based on it. Really understanding, point 1, that source information doesn't exist, and point 2, that the accumulated data from a source that doesn't exist also does not exist, gives you a much better understanding, or will, of how the real estate market is going to operate and how you need to work around that lack of information. And given that lack of information, it is a completely different game. At number 3 is the lack of liquidity. The Nicaraguan market, as it stands in 2025, and it has stood for many years at this point, a minimum of 2/3 of a decade, and realistically quite a bit longer, although it does fluctuate to some degree. But for the last several years, at least half a decade, there has been nearly zero liquidity on the Nicaraguan market. And this means everywhere. There are tiny niche areas where you get a little bit of liquidity simply because a few neighbors have been able to sell houses. But even the communities that advertise most that the market is hot and it's time to get in and great opportunity have essentially zero liquidity. There's nowhere in the country where we're actually seeing high liquidity, large selling pace. There are homes for sale in huge numbers all across the country, and this has remained. The average house stays on the market for a very long time. It is not in any way shocking to hear about people who have been attempting to sell a single property actively for as much as 20 years. This is a really important thing to internalize. Like the first points, these are big surprises for a lot of people. They think, well, property values tend to be very safe in Nicaragua. They tend to hold their value over the long haul, and that is absolutely true. But without liquidity, holding your value, your wealth store in property may be a surprise that you're unable to extract wealth back out of it. And many people are simply unwilling to sell homes unless they're really getting a great deal. So you'll see homes during times of downturn simply being held onto and not selling at all, which is good that it helps retain property values to some degree, but it does completely wipe out liquidity. And so for a lot of people who end up buying homes, even if they get very good deals on them, they may be stuck holding on to those houses or properties for a very long time, which if that is your goal, that could work out just fine. But if your idea is that you're going to buy and sell quickly, or that you're going to buy and if you change your mind, you can simply sell and move on, that lack of liquidity may really impact you. And almost everyone has been told that some spot that they're looking at in Nicaragua is an exception, and that place is liquid. Oh, sure, the rest of Nicaragua is illiquid, but this one particular spot is high liquidity. There's constant demand, and that's simply not true. There could be isolated sales. Of course, people do buy houses. We do see growth. Places like El Doral are growing quite well, but these are not places that have more than a handful of expats purchasing in them, and they are selling at very low prices. We're not seeing the inflated prices in those places. So, and even there, the liquidity remains pretty low. It's just slightly higher than we see other places. And mostly we're seeing new home growth. There is a growing population, and so new homes are needed, and we see those going in all the time. But generally those are starter homes, houses in the $25,000 to $45,000 range, people who are moving up from barrio houses or moving out from cramped multi-generational barrio homes into starter homes for mid-income, mid-life stage, early age parents looking at having more space for themselves. In many cases, that tends to be where we see that mobility. So there are homes that buy and sell on the market. That is true, but the rate at which they do so is extremely low. And to be clear, the majority of the liquidity on the market remains in the barrios, partially because so few houses go onto the market that you don't really have a need for so many to turn over, but also when homes do go into the market in either starter home communities, El Doral or similar, or when you're in the barrios, these are the everyday transactions where no one's making money on the real estate. It is simply a family home that is no longer needed and another family needs it, and so they're buying it roughly at value. We're often talking about values below $30,000, and very often could be dramatically below $30,000. In some cases, we're talking below $15,000. We may be talking transactions that don't have any money changing hands at all. So that is where we have a tendency to see the liquidity. Once we're talking reasonable homes that expats are likely to be looking at purchasing, those above $50,000 or $60,000, liquidity is extremely low. So be prepared that anything you decide to invest in that you're actually going to own, you need to be prepared for the possibility that you'll have to hold on to it for the long haul, and be extra prepared that if you overpay, and this is why we are so adamant in so many discussions about the dangers of overpaying. If you pay, say, $100,000 for a home and it turns out that that house was only worth $70,000, then you are going to either have to lose $30,000 to be able to put it on to the market at a reasonable price, or you are going to lose any hope of liquidity. Generally, if you have a house that you've overpaid for, if you wait long enough, you will eventually recoup most of that money. It just depends how long you have to wait. But when we're talking about numbers like this, which is common that you may overpay by 50% to 1,000%, 10 times to 1,000%, these overpayments, even at 50%, is so dramatic that often you could be looking at decades to be able to sell the home, if ever. You may be stuck until you bring those prices down. And so for a lot of people who think, well, I'll overpay and I'll just wait it out and I'll get that money eventually. That eventually could be 100 years out, not a year or two extra. That really confuses people coming from a North American market, where you can often overpay for a house and it's just like you bought the house a few years later. You just have to wait a little bit longer and you'll generally recoup the amount. So this is for two reasons. One is that in the American market, we often have bubbles that go up. They also come down, but when they're going up, you generally have this growth pace where you will be able to eventually recoup the money. You will lose overall. It's still a bad investment, but there will be a time where you can at least get your money back and not have a hard loss. We also have this really high liquidity rate where everything can turn over quite quickly. In Nicaragua, both of those things are untrue. The value typically does not go up with any regular pattern and there's very low liquidity. So everything that we approach with this assurance that buying a house is a safe thing and we'll definitely be able to, deal with it. Plus, in America, people typically only overpay by maybe 5 and an extreme 10%. But in Nicaragua, an overpayment is generally 50% at a minimum. Overpaying by 100 or 200% is absolutely normal. And so you have to be really careful, because overpaying by 200%, you can imagine that you will never be able to recoup the money from that house ever in a lifetime, even in your children's lifetime. Point number 4 really helps explain point number 3, and that is that homes, especially homes and sometimes property in Nicaragua, have a tendency to stay within a single family multi-generationally, meaning, as you can expect, that quite often a home has been handed down, grandparents to parents, and then to children and to grandchildren, and it is relatively common for a home to never leave the family, and this creates the lack of liquidity in an even more dramatic sense, that it is very, very often assumed that a home will not be sold. There's no accommodations for it. No one has thought about it. In many cases, they don't maintain the paperwork to be able to sell a house, even if they want to, which is often the case by those grandchildren. You may have 16 grandchildren who now each own a small slice of a family home, and all of them are unsure who should get to use it or how they should sell it. And even if they all 16 got together and all decided to sell their ancestral home, which is a difficult thing already, because they know they're not going to be able to sell it quickly. There's very little demand. They're not going to get a great price for it. But generally, one of those 16 people is going to be absolutely convinced by some outside source that the house is worth outrageous amounts of money. The other 15 are desperate to just get a few hundred or maybe a few $1,000s and be done with the house and not have to have it anymore, and just get to be able to use the money rather than fighting and maintaining a house. But that one holdout is able to stop any sale, and so you have this complete standstill in the market. So you find homes that you think people would want to sell all over the country. Wow, they're not really using it. It's in disrepair. I could give them a really good price for it, and all that may be true, but all it takes is one person who's like, I would just like to hold on to the house. It has memories for me, or I'm attached to it because it was my great-grandfather's home, or whatever. That one person can stop everyone else from selling because of the way that property laws work, and that's not entirely surprising, but very few places that we're used to, especially North America and Europe, have this hand the home down to our children mentality, and keep the home mentality. In my family, of course, family homes are handed down, but they're then sold, and then people just split the money, or they're liquidated immediately, and the money is just split. It is rare for a family to take a family home and keep it, unless it goes to just a single family member, and even then, it's still pretty rare to keep it. Here, it is very common for families to remain in a single physical location or very, very close, same neighborhood. And so a parent's home given to children often is sitting across the street or at most across town. And so it isn't this, well, remote house very far away. Like if my family in Ohio was to leave me a house, well, it would be a house in Ohio that I can never use. I would just want to sell it. Even if there are memories attached to it, I can never go there and enjoy them. It is impractical. So I'd want to sell that house. Even if it was a house back home in New York where I grew up, even if it was my family farm, which I would love to be able to have retained. But when my father was ready to move into an apartment, the question was, should we keep the farm? And the answer was very simply, no. As much as we all wish we could keep it for nostalgic sake, it was the farm where I was essentially born. We moved there when I was 100 days old. We didn't sell it until I was in my 40s. My entire life was centered around that farm. We built that house for my mother. We had all of our horses and dogs and cats and hamsters and raccoons all there on that farm. So many memories, so many activities, such a beautiful location with beautiful views, but there was no practical means of keeping it. It was not something that I was going to be able to use as an adult. My children would never see it again. They just would never travel back to New York just to go visit the farm that I grew up on. Yes, they have good memories there, but they were very little, and it's just too impractical to travel that far to enjoy those memories. So as North Americans, it is really common for us to simply liquidate property all the time. We see it as an investment. But Nicaraguans often see it as a part of their family. And so that contributes to a lack of liquidity and also contributes to the impression that you go around and you will easily find homes that you're sure someone will want to sell. In many cases, decrepit homes that have fallen down and cannot be used because they're in total disrepair, still someone will be a holdout and be unwilling to unload that house. Or in many cases, you cannot locate the people who actually own the house because they're not actively involved with it and they've just let it kind of go to seed, as you might say. And so there's a lot of difficulties. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try. There's absolutely, you may be the first person who's ever put in the effort to track everyone down, and they may be relieved that someone is interested in buying their old family home that they thought no one would buy, and you can get everyone together, make a good offer, and actually buy the house. But it's an important point that this is a cultural home buying and selling mechanism that is generally non-existent in North America and can be very confusing or surprising to those who are entering this market for the first time. Point number 5. In North America, we're used to a heavy financing market. We assume that the buying and selling of homes involves a bank and a lot of financing. You can do it in cash, of course, but it is completely abnormal, and we'd be very surprised if that was actually going to happen. Here in Nicaragua, there's essentially no financing. It is not true that there is no financing, but you should approach the market as if there is no financing. Even Nicaraguans will struggle to find financing, and if they do find it, it will be outrageously expensive. There are exceptions, primarily when we're talking about new builds where a builder is working through their own corporate financing mechanisms with a bank, and they're only financing the profits and not the actual cost, the hard cost of the property. In those cases, you may be able to get financing that appears like you're getting a traditional mortgage, but you're actually only financing the profit portions for a builder. It's a completely different thing, and in reality, it's not you getting the loan, it's the builder in your name getting the loan and guaranteeing that it'll get paid or that they won't take the profits or whatever. There's a completely different mechanism there. Under normal circumstances, if you're simply just buying a home, you will be really challenged to get any bank willing to give you a loan. If they are, they're going to have to put a lot into the home. There's going to have to be a lot of collateral because there's simply no reasonable way, for all the reasons we mentioned, that they cannot sell the home to reclaim losses on the mortgage. Without that liquidity, there's no way for them to do so. Getting a reclaimed home, forfeit home, during a financial transaction is all but worthless to a bank and could actually turn into a negative. They may have to maintain or do something to secure a home that they can't make any money on. That's a pretty dramatic financial situation for a bank. So banks do not see the ability to pull back a home under normal circumstances as a significant collateral on the loan. So you'd have to provide something else. If you're able to provide something else, you generally want to simply use those resources to buy a home, not to finance it. But because there is no financing, for all intents and purposes, it does do a lot to keep the overall prices of the market down and to avoid real estate inflation bubbles. So because of this, there are advantages. It is much easier to buy a home in cash because there isn't the availability of financing to drive up the prices. If you have $25,000 in cash and you're able to buy a home and someone else only has $20,000 in cash, you're going to be able to get that home. You can drive the price up to $25,000 and outbid them. If this was the United States, that person could go to the bank and take out a loan for up to $40,000 or $50,000 or $60,000. And if that's a home that they really want, they could come back and drive the price up well beyond what would be rational to pay for. And this is a major danger in markets, in markets where we have a lot of financing, because people get emotional and they don't see the money as being a concrete thing. They don't think about the fact that they actually have to earn that money and pay it back to the bank with interest over time, because they tend to look at the monthly payments and say, can I afford that? And not look at the overall price and say, is it worth that? And so because of that, this emotional disconnect and availability of larger funds drives a market to where homes buy and sell far beyond what they natively would be valued at. In Nicaragua, we don't really have that, and so it helps a lot to maintain a very low-cost housing market and to discourage people from taking out or attempting to take out mortgages. If you did manage to take out a mortgage, you would quickly learn why you don't want to do that. Generally, the rates that we're used to in North America vary from about 1 to maybe 6 or 7%. At the extremes, maybe 8 or 9%, which is outrageous, and we tell people not to take them out when it gets anywhere close to that. You really want to take them out between 1 and 3%. Here in Nicaragua, you could be looking at percentages much closer to 20% or more. and with terms that are often longer than you would really want. And very importantly, it is standard in North America that if you pay off a loan early, your interest is only on the amount of money that you borrowed for the amount of time that you borrowed it. Meaning you could borrow $1 million at a really high rate today, but pay it all off tomorrow and only owe maybe a few dollars of interest, or maybe it would be a few $100s of interest on $1 million, but it wouldn't be an outrageous amount of interest. You could certainly do that. Here in Nicaragua, if you were to take out $1 million loan today that's on a 20-year term, but paid it off tomorrow, you would still owe millions of dollars because you'd have 20 years of interest due immediately. Now, they don't make you pay it until that 20-year period is over, of course, but the fact that the final amount of money is due happens instantly. There is no pay it off early. That concept doesn't exist in the Nicaraguan market. Of course, you could mention it, but no one offers it. So that is a major difference. We always talk about paying early in the US market, how you can earn more money over time and pay faster and you reduce your burden from the interest. All that is very true. But we also have the issue that the interest normally on mortgages in the United States and Canada is so low that you don't want to pay it off early. You want to use that money somewhere more productively. But in Nicaragua, the interest on your loans is so high that you would want to pay it off early, but they don't offer the ability to pay it off early. So you're trapped. So you really want to avoid taking out mortgages if at all possible. This is also true for cars or anything else. Find ways to buy things in cash. It will save you an immense amount of money in the long run, and it just helps keep the market that much lower. So that's an important thing to understand, that you are almost always going to have to either come up with some kind of creative financing where you're figuring things out on your own, or you're going to need to source money from outside the country, which is super difficult. No normal situation are you going to get a foreign bank to loan you money for purchasing something in another country. Doesn't matter what country it is, they just don't work that way. They have no way to come after you. So generally, you're having to take out personal funds to be able to make a transaction. Our next point is that lotifications, or developments, as they are known outside of Nicaragua, often don't get finished. What is a lotification? So this is a Spanish word here in Nicaragua that means when you take a plot of land and divide it into smaller lots. We just call them developments in most places, but that's what you'll see on signs most of the time in Nicaragua. And they turn into, when they're done, residencias in most cases. So that is kind of the maturation of the lotification process. Lotification is generally the term that we're using when they're just lots and you buy the empty lot with the intent of putting a house on it. In many cases, the developer sells the lot and they build the house, but it could be that you buy the lot and you build the house as well. But very importantly, it is extremely common. Now, I do need to point out, residencias are extremely common. Most countries, and Nicaragua is no exception. There are many wonderful residencias all throughout the country, and there are new ones that open on a regular basis. So this is not a hard and fast rule. It is simply an important bit of information that you need to realize, because this is something that is pretty uncommon in North America, and that is that lotifications will be opened up and never completed. We can find all over the country, and I've shown them on many of my walks through barrios and different neighborhoods, lotifications that have been sitting idle for many years or decades, and clearly are long since abandoned. What often happens is that someone will buy a plot of land, think they've got a great deal, divide it into lots, offer those lots at incredibly high prices. So for example, they may buy a few manzanas, that's 1.7 acres each. We could do another video as to why it is that way. And they will divide that into a lot of really tiny lots that they try to sell at $5,000 or $10,000 each, when the entire thing was only $10,000, right? So they're looking at massive markup, and they think they've got a big windfall. Plus, they're hoping to construct the houses on them in many cases. But in order to be able to really sell them, they've got to put in roads and water and sewage and power and internet and a bunch of things, and that takes money. Often the people who are doing this don't have very much money. Well, in some cases they do, and they just don't want to spend it. They're waiting for people to buy the lots, but the first people to buy those lots are taking a pretty big risk because none of the infrastructure that they need exists there. Plus, in many cases, there's an HOA or something similar to it that has deep control over them, and they don't have very much voting power because they're just one person. And so they end up, if you can get someone to buy that first lot, right? Now, in some cases, it's really common to find lotifications where no one has ever purchased ever. In those cases, it's just a person who bought some land, put up a sign, and nothing more ever happened. So we can mostly ignore those. But in many cases, we find lotifications where someone has done this, they've divided them into lots, and the first 1 or 2 houses will go in. The Milleret facility in Sutiava is one example. There's one, I don't know its name, just south of the airport in Leon. That is a good example where 2 houses went in. And you can see that there was a future where several more houses were meant to be in these places. There's empty lots that are now overgrown. There's just weeds. The signs that used to say that there was a lotification available are faded and unreadable, but you can tell that they were there. And you can see that 1 or 2 people went in and invested in what they thought would be a bright future. And if they are lucky, ended up at least having livable quarters that they got into. But in many cases, especially in the San Juan del Sur area, where this was a really major pandemic of people just buying empty spaces and never constructing, because in those cases, you actually had the problem that your neighbors quite often bought lots and never built houses on them. And you needed to build the houses to have the infrastructure come in. So in some cases, it's the builder never manages to sell the lots, and so the infrastructure never gets built. But in some other cases, in many other cases, especially where there's a lot of expats, you have a situation where many expats may buy the lots and think that when values go up, they're going to build a house on what is in the future an expensive lot, but isn't yet, or they're waiting for their neighbors to put in their houses so that infrastructure comes in and they can build around that, or they simply were planning on the value going up and reselling it or whatever, and you end up with entire hillsides of beautiful, what should be very expensive lots that are all abandoned, and the roads never get completed, or they get completed and then fall apart because there's no one to maintain them, and they don't get their water put in, they don't get their electric put in. And so if you go in and purchase one of those lots, you may end up in a situation where you don't have the ability to build your house. You would have to gather a bunch of your neighbors and convince them all to move forward with building houses in order to end up in a situation where you're able to live in your house, or you may have to sell a bunch of empty lots, or you may just end up in a functional home but in what you thought was going to be a beautiful residencia, and instead is a tiny lot for you and your house surrounded by a bunch of abandoned properties. And you may have been thinking you were going to have a beautiful gate and all kinds of services in your community because you were getting in with a bunch of other people, and it turns out just to be you or you and one neighbor, and you'd better really like that neighbor because the two of you are now tied together very strongly. It's going to be extremely hard to resell your house. Maybe you got in cheap, just $70,000, but realistically, if you don't have neighbors coming in, your house is only worth maybe $40,000 or $45,000 now, because it is now known that you took a gamble and lost. And so you have to be really careful with lotifications to make sure that you're not one of the early adopters. You have to be really confident that the momentum is in place, that it's going to keep going or has already completed, and so that you know you're going to get the home and community that you're planning on. Number 7, advertised prices that you see on homes 99% of the time are utter nonsense. People have no idea what their house should be worth. This is a general problem. It's not just you who doesn't know what prices are. It's not just you that doesn't have access to an MLS. It's not just you that doesn't have access to previous sales records. The person who owns a house doesn't know either. They may have a tiny bit of information about their house or maybe their immediate neighbors that you don't have, but just because they've owned there or lived in that community longer than you. So they may have a small amount of additional insight, but they don't have a lot of insight. They have a very difficult time assessing what their own house is worth, and all they can guess is what sounds good to advertise. So if you're in North America, again, if you're in the United States, like where I am recording right now in Houston, Texas, if I wanted to sell a 4-bedroom, 2-bath home in a community that I'm in, I can go on Zillow and see what every one of my neighbors has sold for in the past 2 years. I can see how that trend has moved over time. I can make some predictions about what it should be different ways. Zillow will provide me a Z estimate as to about what they think my house should be worth. I've heard those are pretty bad, but at least it gives you a starting point. And none of it is off by huge numbers. It's extremely tight numbers across the board, and so you can look, even without having access to an MLS, you can come up with the value of your house to within a tiny sliver of a few percent. Doing the same thing in Nicaragua, utterly impossible. So even as the homeowner, you're just wildly guessing. And so you may say your house is worth 200,000 when in reality it may be worth 40,000. Those are the kinds of numbers that people will do. But it is also normal to throw out huge numbers with an expectation that people will then talk you down. I recently had someone try to sell me a property that I estimate was worth between 4,000 and 6,000. I might be willing to spend 7,000 on it because I'm able to, and it's not that much of an oversell, although percentage-wise that's pretty stupid and I shouldn't do that. They immediately came to us with $35,000. Now, for us, we simply said, we're not willing to negotiate with anyone who started so high. And they came back with, but it's a number to negotiate from. And we're like, it's not a serious number to negotiate from. It's just insulting. And we didn't continue that conversation. And that is often what we've gone through. The people will start with properties that we think should be worth just $10,000 or so. They'll come and start with like 300,000. And in some cases, they will come down to 10,000. In some cases, they act like they won't budge. It's all over the map. But you have to understand that the numbers that people throw out are expected to be utter gibberish. They're not tied to anything. They're not reflective to someone's confidence in selling the house. They're not reflective of some prices they've seen somewhere else. They're not reflective of anything. It is simply someone personally taking a wild guess as to what they think the person who might be listening to the number will think of that number, and what they're trying to do is manipulate you into spending the highest possible amount for their house, whatever that is, but no one knows what that is. So the one thing you have to know is that whatever number someone's starting with means nothing. It doesn't tell you what its value is, it doesn't tell you what they assessed it at, and it doesn't tell you what they think they're probably going to get as an offer. It is disconnected from reality in every meaningful way, and you have to think of it that way. And that leads us directly into point 8, which is all property value in Nicaragua is dramatically lower than what you think it is. And this is why in point 7, people are willing to throw out these crazy numbers, because from time to time, they get people who are so disconnected from reality, who are so not doing their own research, that they actually fall for prices at even 1,000% markup. So it's sometimes worth it to do what we call the Hail Mary, and see my video called The Hail Mary that talks about this from many years ago. But people throw these numbers out there in the hopes of finding people who are very confused, and then they'll gauge how confused they are and manipulate the conversation based on that. Whereas if in North America you'd come back with these, MLS numbers, you can't use those wild numbers as a way to gauge how little someone knows about the market. But here it's pretty effective. So that is partially why that is done. And if you do research online, if you're looking at these wild numbers, it's easy to become confused about the values on the market, and it's easy to end up in a situation where you may actually think that really high numbers sound kind of reasonable. Maybe you understand that the numbers they're saying are high, but you almost always will come back believing property to be worth more than it actually is. The values in Nicaragua, by and large, are staggeringly low. Even if you've lived here for a number of years, even if you've become accustomed to the transactions, you will still often travel around the country and really be shocked at when you find people who are really negotiating well, what houses and properties are actually selling at, and even in places where you're sure the prices are really high. And there are exceptions, right? Villa Fontana in Managua really does have pretty high prices. But if you're going to like San Juan del Sur, people will swear up and down. You can talk to 20 people that a property is worth $2 million plus and no one will budge, and you walk in the door, find the owner, and they will take $250K on the spot without negotiating. The amount that people are so en masse convinced that the prices are higher, but they're not the ones buying or selling, is so dramatic. And there's entire developments. I talk to people all the time who say, well, there's this development, every house is worth at least 150K. But I talk to people in that development and they say no house will sell even at 40K. They're struggling to sell houses. So the value is only around 40K, maybe 38K. At some number it would sell, right? Drop it enough, I'll buy it, right? So there is a number that makes those houses worthwhile. But you will get so many people who aren't actually shelling out their own money telling you, well, we've heard, everyone says it's worth this huge amount. And then when the rubber hits the road, no one's paying those numbers. And the real sales numbers are saying that the liquidity doesn't exist. And to even get what little liquidity there is, you're talking about numbers that are just 40K, 45K instead of 150K. That's really surprising, but you have to really internalize. And I say this a lot, so much of real estate in Nicaragua is you've got to internalize these things and stop bringing this mentality of high prices are normal, that things will sell quickly and so forth. The prices in Nicaragua are low. They're always low. When people tell you, oh, the prices are going up, things are moving fast, it's all lies. It's all an attempt to convince you to pay way more and to jump on purchasing before you really have a chance to dig in and figure out what's going on. Everyone who wants to sell you a house depends on you purchasing quickly before you've had time to realize what the real market prices are like, what the real risks are like, what things you could get for your money. If you're going to spend $80,000 on a house and that house is only worth 60K, whoever's selling that to you, whether it's the agent, whether it's the homeowner, it's everyone, right? Everyone involved, everyone who's making money off that transaction needs to get you to believe that you're getting a deal, that it could sell quickly, that there's other people trying to buy it, that it's a great value. They need to get you to close, because the more time you're in Nicaragua, the more you talk to people, the more you look at other houses, the more you hear about what real values are like, the faster you will go, wait a second, this doesn't seem like I'm getting an $80,000 house. It seems like I'm getting a $60,000 house. Am I doing something crazy? Maybe I shouldn't do this. Everybody selling a house has so much incentive to push you through and to keep you from realizing that you could do this research and figure out what these prices really are. And so it's just really important to understand the numbers are really low, and everyone has an incentive to make you think they're really high. Number 9, property taxes are really low. I don't know the exact number, and it's complicated because of the way that the system works. The government has to assess your property and do some value based on that. I've had people come to me with a lot of myths and crazy thoughts about how property taxes would work, and in many cases they think that the taxes would be really high, which of course makes no sense, because Nicaraguans wouldn't be able to afford to live in their own homes if that was the case. Some people believe that it's based on the sale price, but the government doesn't know the sale price, so that would be a major problem if they were letting that be done in that way. It's simply the government has to set a price and then charge a tax on that. What I do know is that as someone with property in Nicaragua, the property taxes, comparing it to what we're used to in North America, are outrageously low. Maybe they're in line with the rest of the world, maybe they're even high with much of the world. I've only owned property in so many countries, but comparing to places like New York and Texas, which Texas is high compared to New York, and New York is high compared to Nicaragua, very, very high. And so that is just an important thing to understand. If someone is telling you that property taxes are high or of any real concern, someone is pulling your leg, or possibly someone is pulling their leg at some point. Maybe they end up paying a third party who's pocketing a bunch of money or something. Those kinds of things can happen. Do your own research, but don't let people tell you that property values are high. That is one thing. It is just a common scam, obviously, that we've been talking about, but that people will also come back with this any way to make Nicaragua sound expensive for whatever reason, and trying to claim that property taxes are high, that any of the taxes are high, is a really surprising one, because it's very visible that the taxes are quite reasonable or low throughout almost every aspect of society. To say that the property taxes are high just doesn't make sense in context when you really look around and see how people live. Now, of course, if you have $1 million home, you will have noticeable taxes in most cases. If you have a $100,000 home, you probably won't. That's really those kinds of numbers. It's so wildly different compared to North America. So just internalize, it's going to be a very low number, lower than you've probably ever witnessed, not just because the house values are low, but as a percentage, it is also incredibly low. At number 10, I want to point this one out, and this is very much a personal take on this matter, but leases are not a negative. In fact, it is something that I often seek out when looking to buy property. What do we mean? So in Nicaragua, there are multiple ways that you can buy houses, as far as your actual property. For example, you can get a traditional deed, just like you would have in North America. You're used to this. It's what everyone talks about for regular property. You can also get a real, which is highly sought after, but very difficult to get. These go back to the original Spanish colonial times and come directly from the king. So those, while cool, are extremely difficult to get. If you're along a coastal zone, it is relatively common to run into indigenous leases. This is where the indigenous community holds the rights to the land and leases it to you under a very tight government-controlled contract for 99 years with automatic renewals based on a number of actions. These leases, to a lot of people, even Nicaraguans and even even expats who've lived in the country for a very long time often sound like a negative, but I'm going to argue that they are not. In fact, I believe they are a positive. For one reason, they help keep the prices down because casual investors and emotional panicky investors have a tendency to avoid them. So because they're avoiding them, that doesn't drive up the prices as much. So it eliminates a whole bunch of the buyers that kind of get in the way in other markets. It leaves just the more serious buyers, those who do the research and understand that the emotional reaction to that doesn't make sense because it is a contractual lease. If your fear is that the government is not going to honor the contracts of the property laws, then you're really in a position where you don't believe in property value at all. So it doesn't just extend to the lease. There's no reason to question the lease unless you're questioning absolutely everything. And if you're going to do that, then don't even look at the market. You can't buy anything. So if you're in any way being serious about the market, the lease thing isn't going to be a problem for you. It is not a temporary lease. There's always a mechanism to renew the lease. It does protect you against certain actions that your neighbors could take. It does give you the extra power of the indigenous community. For me personally, maybe this is emotional, so take it with a grain of salt, but my feeling on this, having dealt with both with the majority of my property purchases being under lease and my others being under real, I, of course, want a real. Everyone wants a real. That is the absolute best property. Nothing is more clear than a real. But second to that, I want a lease, and that's what I have. So as an investor, this is where my own money goes when possible. I am absolutely fine with getting into the lease system. My feeling from it, while it does have a little extra complications, it does have a few extra little costs because of the indigenous community, it does allow us to get into places where we have more interesting property, more varied property, less competition for that property, and importantly for me, I feel that the indigenous community is able to help protect that property in ways that we'd be more on our own in other places, and I like having that additional. It's almost like having an HOA, but one where you don't pay into it, or you do, but it's part of your upfront taxes in purchasing the property through the transfer, and you don't make ongoing payments necessarily to maintain an HOA, but you have a community who's able to act as a community to protect your property. And personally, because I'm getting the property for the purpose of behaving well, I feel that that is in my favor. If I was planning on doing nefarious things with the property, I suppose I would see that as a negative, that I'd be more exposed because there's more insight into what I'm doing. Maybe that's a reason to consider. But for me, because I want to help the community, because I want to do good things with the property, because I'm not trying to do anything I shouldn't do with the property, having that additional layer of indigenous government or oversight or governance in the process, to me, feels like a bonus. And the lease system is so easy to deal with and so straightforward. I cannot fathom why anyone has any negative reaction to it whatsoever, as long as you understand what it is. Of course, when you hear lease, of course your mind should go to, okay, I need to understand what this lease is. Absolutely. But once you understand what it is, it should be, wow, this is fantastic. I like this system. I would, at very least, I would not avoid it. And at best, I might actually seek it out as a preferable way to buy. So that is my 10 points that I think everyone needs to know in 2025 for getting into real estate in Nicaragua. Thank you so much for joining me. Like and subscribe. If you'd like to help support the work that we do here, please consider buying me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Allen Miller. The link will be on the screen, and everything is in the show notes. How to sponsor me through there, how to join our community. You can join in Buy Me a Coffee. You can join on YouTube with the join button. How to contact me. My email is in there. My social media is in there. My other channels are in there. Anything you might need, including if you have questions, real estate or otherwise, about Nicaragua, living in Latin America, being an expat, leaving your home country, living abroad, traveling around Latin America or Europe, by all means, send in a video question where you actually are on the show. All the information for that is in the show notes, or just get down in the comments, ask a question there, leave a comment, say hello, interact, get to know each other. And remember, on Thursday evenings, we do a live stream. We try very hard to do it every Thursday. It's a great time to get in and talk to a bunch of people like yourself who have questions or want to get to know people who are moving to Nicaragua or are just community members here on the channel. And we also have a WhatsApp Expats of Nicaragua group that you can go check out down in the show notes and join us there. A great way to communicate with a lot of people as well. That's a very vibrant community. 2, I really appreciate all of you who live in my little GoPro box and are joining me. I am filming from a hotel in in Houston, Texas at the moment, but I will be. I'm only here for a few days. I did manage to get my driver's license. I will be back in action in Nicaragua long before you see this video. So I appreciate it. If you do want to help support the show in other ways, watch another video. Even letting one play in the background makes a big difference. Tell someone else about this show. Post links on social media. Share it. Get the word out about the show. Let people know about moving to Latin America, Nicaragua, expatting, and all those things. And I will see all of you tomorrow.